We are live. I hope the sound is okay. Welcome to Journey of an Aesthete podcast. I'm just checking to make sure in the comments here. This is the episode 4 of a mini-series I'm doing. I'm your host, Mitch Hampton. Mini-series I'm doing on Romanticism. In particular, Isiah Berlin's very complex, multi-layered theory of what Romanticism was and is. And we're going to venture outward a little bit in this episode. I remember the last episode we discussed, I used movie clips. I should reiterate here the Copyright Act of 1976, which is a fair use doctrine, which provides the right for commentary, criticism, analysis of books, movies, TV shows, lectures, in the case of this lecture, for a show. So I'm going to return. I'm going to make two moves in sort of maybe different directions. I'm going to go back to Berlin here and listen to a little bit of his discussion of Romanticism, just to get us with the sound of his voice, because it's been a while perhaps. And then I'm going to go and talk about some other figures. So let's listen to a little bit of this. See what happened if you don't catch it. This is what I'll... Here we go. So he's discussing what we call the Enlightenment. And he's saying that there's basically 3 pillars, 3 principles, 3 laws, if you will, that of course, long predate the Enlightenment itself. Some of them may indeed even go back to antiquity or earlier. And I'd like to hear him talk about the three principles. Many of those 3, you in the audience might hold or agree with, possibly, because they remain popular. I'm going to play a little bit of it, and then we're going to talk about what happens when cracks in those principles or skepticism about those principles. Yes, the material is used for the purpose of commentary and criticism, the fair use doctrine of copyright law. No copyright infringement is intended under Section 10. Thank you, Laurie Strickland, our producer, and Chester, her wonderful companion. And, well, let's hear a little of Berlin. Again, as I've said before, he's one of the greatest orators of the 20th century. And you hear in this Mellon lectures in 66, 65, some of that.
The of these lectures is to be. I shall today discuss the first onslaught upon the Enlightenment. Next time I propose to continue with that, and in particular to deal with the attitudes and the ideas and the effects of the ideas of Rousseau, Kant, and Schiller. Mm-hmm. In the 4th lecture, I propose to deal with the real full blast effect of Romanticism, both upon the arts and upon literature and on thought and life. In the 5th lecture, I propose to deal with the specific results of it in the early 19th century, and in particular.
Okay, so he's
and in the last lecture, I
given the
propose
program
to summary of all that
what he's going to do,
and consider what parts of it are alive and what parts of it are dead for us now, what effect it has had, is having, and even perhaps is likely to have upon our own lives.
Until us in the future, yeah.
Let me therefore go back to the subject of which I spoke. The Enlightenment of the late 17th and early 18th century needs some definition. There are certain propositions, if you like to boil them down to that, which are, as it were, the 3 legs upon which the whole Western tradition rested. These are not confined to the Enlightenment, although the Enlightenment gave a particular version, transformed them in a particular manner.
Notice the subordinate clauses. Again, I really love this mode of prose and speech because it creates associations and creates wonderful, in this case, good hierarchies of arranging importance in the syntax. So he said that it's not restricted to make sure to include the Enlightenment is what we know to have solidified these things, but they're not restricted. So you find, I guess you could say pre-Enlightenment, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, antiquity, pagan, Greek, similar things. I just wanted to reiterate
These
that.
three principles are
These statements are
roughly these.
These.
That
Number one.
all genuine questions can be answered. That if a question cannot be answered, it is not a question.
I like that. If you can't answer a question, that is, you can't find an answer to the question, or there is not an answer to the question. There's a distinction between those two things, of course. Then it means it's not even a question. It's, as some of his crowd, not him necessarily, but in the 30s and 40s, the British philosophers are a little bit guilty of this. Some of the logical positivists, Freddie Eyre, they would call such Gilbert Ryle. I discussed a couple of those folks in my Hannah Arendt series. They would say poppycock, hogwash, meaningless statements, that kind of thing. So if you could ask a question, it's got to have an answer to be a question. So
we may not know what the answer is.
We may not know what it is.
Someone else will.
Someone
we may
will.
be too weak, too stupid, or too ignorant to be able to discover the answer for ourselves. In that case, the answer may perhaps be known to persons wiser than we, experts, an elite of some sort. We may be sinful creatures and therefore incapable of ever arriving.
We're just too damn lost and fallen to ever even answer the question. That could be the possibility. We don't know yet. Our science is not advanced enough. He goes through all the wonderful possibilities of not answering the simple damn question, right? This is the thing. It's fun. It's just fun.
By ourselves. In that case, we shall not know it in this world, but perhaps will in the next.
In the next world.
Perhaps it was known in some golden age before the fall of the flood.
Before the fall, before the flood.
As weak and as sinful as we are. Or perhaps the golden age is not in the past, but in the future, and we shall discover the truth then. If not here, there. Yeah. If not now, at some other time. But in principle, the answer must be known, if not to men, then at any rate to an omniscient being, to God. If the answer is not knowable at all, if the answer is in some way is in principle shrouded from us, then there must be something wrong with the question. This is a proposition which is common both to Christian and to scholastic, to Enlightenment, and to positivist tradition of today. It is, in fact, the backbone of what might be called the main Western tradition, and it is this that Romanticism, in a certain sense, cracked. The second proposition is that all these answers are knowable, that is to say, they can be discovered by means which can be learnt and taught to other persons. So there are techniques by which it is possible to learn and to teach ways of discovering what the world consists of, what part we occupy in it, what our relation is to people, what our relation is to things.
So the second one, of course, is that not only that you can answer it, but there's a method, right? And I covered this in an earlier episode. I just want to reiterate it because I want to set us up for some of the figures we're going to get into now. Figures like Denis Diderot and Jacques Rousseau. Now we would say frenemies, but enemies, friends, enemies, their relationship. And of course, I'm going to talk a little bit, hopefully, we're going to get to Bernard Williams, Isiah Berlin's colleague and co-writer on some essays. But, that's kind of fun, right?
What true values are.
There's a method.
Every other serious.
You can intuit it, you can channel it, you can pray for it.
Is that all the answers must be compatible with one another.
Right.
Because if they aren't compatible, then chaos will result. It is clear that the true answer to one question cannot be incompatible with a true answer to another question.
Because it's, didn't you know that the universe is a unified whole? So if that is the case, well, how could these answers contradict or conflict with each other? Of course, I'm not going to, these are things that were believed at that time, and you can't have, one answer. There's that's the view.
It is a logical truth that one true proposition cannot contradict another. If all answers to all questions are to be put in the form of propositions, and if all true propositions are in principle discoverable, then it must follow that there is a description of an ideal universe, a utopia if you like, which simply is that which is described by all true answers to all serious questions. And this utopia is something which, although we may not be able to attain to it, at any rate is that ideal in terms of which we can measure off our own present imperfections. That is the general presupposition, if you like, of the rationalist Western tradition, whether Christian or pagan, whether theist or atheist. Now, the particular twist which the Enlightenment gave to it was to say that the answers were not to be obtained in many of the hitherto traditional.
So, that's a very bold statement he's making. He's saying this is so universally thought at the time that if you're an atheist about to be burned at the stake, and you're the inquisitor from the church doing the burning or delivering the death sentence, that you're thinking the same thing. That even though you're opposed, you both share this prior assumption that, there's something you can find out. And it's just that, the person I'm burning at the stake here, I'm killing, just doesn't read the Bible enough for my taste, or just, doesn't attend my church, and so I'm going to kill him. Or, posted some theses on a door that contradict what my father and grandfather or grandmother taught me. So I'm using these kind of, very sort of kind of dramatic examples to get a sense, saying these are the same. They're the same if we compare the non-believer being burned and the believer burning, and the practicing religionists and secular, Voltaire, Molière, Mark Twain, whomever. Any fill in the blanks of some people share something of this. Well, Twain's post-romantic, so we don't want to get caught up in future centuries, 20th century, 21st century, which we'll do in due time. Due course. So that's kind of just the feeling of it, right?
So, for a little bit familiar to most people.
And the Enlightenment says that we got to get rid of revelation and channeling and intuiting things. That's just bogus. That's why that's why Thomas Jefferson wanted to rewrite the Bible and take out all the supernatural passages. Because as a side note, it was a really common problem in the 18th century. I don't know why I single out that century for this vice, but I feel I have to. I feel I'm moved to do so because Thomas Jefferson, for one thing, wrote essays, treatises against the novel. He's against this thing called the novel. He thinks it's a bad influence, right? And of course, Rousseau was against the theater, wrote long diatribes against the theater, and so this sort of anti-aesthetic, censorious, fearful attitude was exhibited by some of the greatest minds of the period in that century. I think because, like Jefferson rewriting scripture to make sure that it matches the science of the day and doesn't have fantastical things and bushes talking and, people being swallowed by whales, because after all, Thomas Jefferson knows these things just don't happen in real life. It's a way of reading. And it's a way of reading, of course, the Bible and Scripture as if it were not a poem and as if it were a news report of some kind. So it's the irony, of course, is that Jefferson, the non-believer, is actually reading the Bible in a way a fundamentalist would read the Bible, so that he can therefore then reject it and rewrite it and say, well, we just want to have Jesus' ethical teachings and cut out the other bits, right? So this is kind of interesting. And so I want to move ahead a little bit here. A little bit more of Isiah Berlin.
The answer is not to be obtained by revelation, for different
not by revelation, yes.
contradict each other.
Yeah.
Then it's not to be obtained by tradition, because tradition can be shown to be often misleading and false. It is not to be obtained by dogma. It is not to be obtained by individual self-inspection of men of a privileged type, because too many impostors have usurped this role.
Notice the phrase there, you want to beware of the privileged. Doesn't it sound like today's rhetoric on left and right about the evil elites? Don't want to check in with them because they have they have sinister designs upon us, and they are going to fool us. So you can't do revelation. You can't. Not always. Not all the Enlightenment agreed on this. There were many differences between Rousseau and Voltaire and Diderot and about many questions. For example, Rousseau unfortunately thought we were just born good, and a lot of his troubles, which we'll get to in a few minutes, come from that the rigidity of that prior assumption in the flow of life. They're just simply born good. Diderot had a more jaundiced, we would say, wise, chastened account of the human being. And so these are, and of course the role of science, Now, one thing I want to say with Isiah Berlin's a pluralist, I'm a pluralist, Bernard Williams is a pluralist. What do we pluralists think about all this? Well, I can tell you that these three questions, that even the last proposition, the last leg, that compatibility between the answers for us is not always to be obtained. That you could have two different answers of different realms of life in space, current space and time, unity of space and time, that simply do not match up, yet are both true. The term for that is incommensurable. Not incompatible, but incommensurable. So there's many examples of this. Like, for example, I can't be a nun and get married at the same time if I'm a woman, at least given the way the world has been set up heretofore, right? Got to pick one, You can't be in two places at once, We pluralists start from that just assumption to say nothing of the fact that, boy, do people differ from each other in what they like to read and how they like to spend their time, how they worship, what they believe, right? Or not believe, or don't believe, or what they even in their suffering they differ, because they don't suffer life in the same way when they suffer and undergo things. It is a perpetual temptation now, to be a little polemical, to blot out or cover over these differences and try to find commonality. And that's understandable, because after all, we are human and we do have commonality. But to try to always go for the commonality and at the great expense of some of these differences. And this happens all of the time, especially now, since everybody is on the same screens and reading the same stuff, or all the rest of it. So I'm going to turn this off. You've heard a little bit of Berlin. And I'm going to get out some books here. This is Bernard Williams. This book, Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy, which comes out in the mid-'80s. This is my copy from 1985 that I've held all this time. These are my notes. Yeah, 1985. This book was for 30 years, I would say from 85 until maybe the 2000s, was actually required reading in most undergraduate philosophy classes, I think, around the US. So it's kind of a famous book. A lot of students had to undergo it, endure it. I cannot and will not summarize it here. This is not the place for it. Bernard Williams was an Oxford University affiliated philosopher. As I said, he was friends with, colleagues with Isiah Berlin. And Bernard Williams, in the 70s and 80s, made his contribution to philosophy was to call into question, sometimes even, I dare say, attempt to demolish moral theory itself. Systems of moral philosophy. In a famous quip in an essay, I think sometime in the mid-'80s, he said, "Modern philosophy is so damn boring," he was reported to have said. Martha Nussbaum, the two women, there are many women that study with him, Miranda Fricker, many of them British, although Martha remarked that he was, of all male teachers, professors, academics, the most, and this is their word, feminist male philosopher they had ever encountered in their life. Even though he never called himself such. He was too modest to do that. And so I want to make clear that he's not against morality or ethics. Far from it. He has a problem with theories, abstract theories, because for Bernard Williams, and this very much connects to this series, the decisions we make about how to live have to connect with what we feel inside, not a prefabricated, prearranged abstract theory that you write down. And also because our lives are filled with really, really, and it's going to sound cliche, this phrase, but it's still true, tragic choices. Not good versus evil, but good versus good. Or you have to do one of two bad things, which is less bad. These kinds of things, you know. And his writing is filled with all sorts of examples of this. I don't want to belabor that point. I only introduced this book because this was a famous book. And we're gonna talk about this, his last work, Truth and Truthfulness, from 2004, slightly after September 11th. And we're going to, through Bernard Williams and through, you may be familiar with this dude, Lionel Trilling, Sincerity and Authenticity, from 1972. Through them, read or do a reading, if it's all possible, of this, speaking of the 18th century, this wild, crazy masterpiece of Denis Diderot, the nephew of the composer Rameau, from the 1720s, 17. There's a lot of debate over when it was written. And it's interesting. This novel's so important to literary history, to philosophic history, because who were the two people that fell in love with this novel first? Goethe and Schiller. Both Goethe and Schiller translated it practically a whole century later, into German. That translation got into the hands of one Karl Marx, who then, there's a letter writing to his friend Engels, you got to read this guy Diderot, this novel. And it's a dialogic novel between two people, I, or moi, and Louis, he. And through these two characters in dialogue, many quite profound questions are asked about how, Socrates' question that we go back to in philosophy, how should one live? How should one speak? How ought we to live? And this connects because, as I said, Rousseau and Diderot had a falling out over a play that Diderot wrote that Rousseau took as a personal insult. So I don't know where to start. I might start with the Trilling. It's always a problem in doing these episodes because I never know kind of how to proceed or what to do. It'd be mighty interesting to compare two different scholar thinkers' ways of talking about the same material. So let's go back to Trilling. Now, Trilling's interesting for so many reasons, of course. It's interesting in the context of discussion of sincerity and authenticity that Allen Ginsberg, his student, sent him How, and he gave the thumbs down. Did not like Allen Ginsberg's How. I should hope, if you are fans of that great beat poet, not to let Trilling's resistance to what Ginsberg was doing in the 50s deter you from enjoying what he has to say about sincerity and authenticity. But I said it, a couple episodes ago, that you start to have these cracks in the three laws, and you start to get the idea that growing over centuries, that what might be the most important thing of all is what we might today call intention. Even in courts of law, they say, well, what is the intention of the actor? What did the actor mean? So there's that. So let's find here. Where we go here. So Hegel, in Phenomenology of Spirit, the German philosopher Hegel, makes quotes from Diderot's novel in that text. Where are we here? So I said there's me and I said I and you. So who is I in this novel? I guess, is the author. But like in all works of art, it's not literally, just like in the Bible, it's not a literal rib and a literal one real woman named Eve, and and the Book of Revelations, it's not an actual date when such and such is going to happen. No, it's kind of a figure related to the author. So I could be Diderot. If you remember, Gustave Flaubert said, Madame Bovary is moi, is me. I am the female character in my novel, I am Madame Bovary. So he said that. And we can either take him at his word or not. That's up to us. People have different opinions about this. So let's see here. Finally. Let's follow Trilling's prose. Again, Trilling, I want to compare Trilling to Bernard Williams. I mean, Trilling is from a different generation. 40s, 50s, 60s, into the 70s, and Bernard Williams is 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. So different generations, different countries. I know Trilling is a New Yorker, American. Bernard Williams is very, very, like our Isiah Berlin, very, very English, very British. So it might be interesting. So in medias res here, okay. The last of these considerations is a subject of a work which must always have a special place in the development of the ideal of sincerity. Diderot's great dialogue with the scapegrace nephew, imp, right? The kids, as we would say today. That's what Rameau's nephew is. He is like the kids, boorish at times. Well, we'll get into that. The nephew of the composer, great composer, Rameau. Now he goes on to say, as I've said, that the date of the composition is uncertain of Rameau's nephew. Some people say 1761, some people say 1774. Include among the books and manuscripts which were purchased from Diderot by his patron Catherine the Great. So I want you to think about that. Denis Diderot basically invents, more or less, our modern notion of the encyclopedia. He was one of the encyclopedists in France, along with Voltaire and some other figures who just enormous contribution in arts and letters in France and elsewhere. And he has a patron. His patron is Catherine the Great. What can I tell you? It was clandestinely copied, smuggled out of Russia and brought to Germany. Again, as I said, many, many years later. 1803 is the year that Trilling says was brought to Germany. Schiller, Schiller read it first. And so I said, okay, Schiller read it first and sent it to Goethe. Goethe's translation was published in 1805, and this was the version read by Hegel, who cited the dialogue in Phenomenology of Spirit, enshrined it as a work of exceptional significance. Marx sends it to his friend in Manchester, one Frederick Ingalls, for the fresh pleasure, this is Marx's words, fresh pleasure this unique masterpiece will give him. And then Freud reads it, and I think there's something from the letter here. This is going to be inside baseball, inside joke. You have to know Freud. He says, if your little savage, that is to say any boy, were left to himself and to his native blindness, he would in time join the infant's reasoning to the grown man's passion. He would strangle his father and sleep with his mother. Now that Freud really wrote that. So Freud, in a way, is parodying his own theories, the Oedipus complex and all that. Okay. Now, Trilling says it is scarcely possible to describe the protagonist of the dialogue in a way that would be both summary and accurate. The younger Rameau breaks the taboos of respectable reticence, and they're having a conversation in one of the many cafes in France, in Paris. This is important. Cafe life was no different in 1720 than in 1967, or I don't know about today, post-COVID. Maybe no different than today. Go to Paris. I miss Paris. Germaine Dupre. The cafes there. No different. So what Trilling says about the nephew, the kid, is that he wants power and a place in society. Above everything else, he longs for artistic success. He wants adulation. He wants affluence. But he is tortured by envy of his famous uncle and bitter in having to live in his shadow. For Diderot, society is all in all the root and ground of alienation. It is social man who is alienated man. Now that's Trilling's perspective. I'm not so sure. Moi and Louis. So maybe it'd be fun to maybe perform for you if I can. Well, just to give you a taste of the dialogue, I'll play the kid. I'll play Rameau's nephew. A little bit. I don't know. Let's get a sense of this. So in this conversation, in this Paris cafe, they argue about everything. They argue about religion and art and painting and how should one live above all. Is what's inside it counts. Sincerity, masks, all the things, right, that people talk about till this day. So I'm gonna play Rameau's nephew. All the down and outs are sure united in front of food. I wish the devil had taken that accursed observateur littéraire, both the columnist and his columns. That little swine of a priest, the stingy, stinking usurer, is the cause of my undoing. He appeared on the horizon yesterday for the first time, at the hour which drives us all out of our dens, dinner time. When the weather is unkind, happy the man among us who has a 24-sou piece in his pocket. Many a man who jeered at his fellow sponger for arriving in the morning with mud up to his middle and soaked to the skin has got home himself at night in the same state. There was one, I forget now which, who some months ago had a violent set to with the bootblack who had taken up his station outside our door. They were working on credit, and the creditor wanted the debtor to settle the account, but the latter was not in funds. The meal is served, and the abbé is given the place of honor at the head of the table. I come in and see him. What are you presiding, Abbé? Say I. That's all right for today, but tomorrow you will go down one place, please, and the next day one more, and so on, place by place, either to left or right, until having started from the place I once occupied before you. The abbé, who is a decent sort and takes everything in good part, began to laugh. Mademoiselle, struck by the truth of my observation and the aptness of my comparison, began to laugh. Rameau, you've got some nerve. Yes, I know that's why you have me here. A scamp. Same as everybody else, a vagabond. Would I be here if I weren't? I'll have you thrown out. After dinner, I'll go of my own accord. You'd better. It's in quotes, okay? So we dined. I did not miss a mouthful. having eaten well and drunk copiously. Because after all, that wouldn't have made any difference either way, and Sir Belly is a character I have never had anything against. You get the flavor of Rameau's nephew. Now there's a kind of a confusion and commentary on this text about is he right or wrong or who the good guy is, right? And so Hegel famously says that he sides with the nephew and not Diderot, not the author. That all hope for the future rests with the kids, of course. Bernard Williams and Rousseau, Bernard Williams thinks otherwise. So I think Bernard Williams is a little more helpful here. Because I don't know. Where are we here? So in this book, Truth and Truthfulness, and he's writing this book right after September 11th. And right before his death. In a way, it's kind of a deathbed book in a way. When does he die? 06, 05? And this comes out, and this is I got this copy when it came out. And this is Bernard Williams saying, well, I've attacked all these systems of thought, these theories, right? But he felt moved to say, well, what do I then think is true? There is truth, and what is the best means of finding out what that truth is? And so he wrote this wonderful, but I can't recommend this book enough. So in one of the chapters here, he calls the chapter The State of Nature. And it's a story, and story is capitalized and nature is capitalized. The state of nature, which is a condition where people sort of share the same talk, the linguistic rules of their language, and the same space. So like a desert, an island of some kind, or a jungle, or remote, in that state of nature. There is no writing. And they're just sort of, these people are just occupying. So that's kind of a metaphor, So his first passage in chapter 8, from Sincerity to Authenticity, he says, the invention of historical time in the 5th century BC brought about a conception of the past that had not been available earlier. So it's invented in the 5th century, historical time, linear time. And he goes on to say, the rise of these ideas has deeply affected our present conceptions of truthfulness and its relations to the self. And these conceptions are among those that notably give grounds for philosophical puzzlement and concern. My main suggestion will be that the invention was ambiguous. And that underlying these new ideas of authenticity, there have been two different conceptions of the self and of self-understanding, which imply different ideas of sincerity and its relation to society. These two different conceptions are associated with two very different writers, Rousseau, it's Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Denis Diderot. So what do they say? They were contemporaries, they were friends, and later became, or as Rousseau felt at least, enemies, after a falling out that had at its heart, more than anything else, these two different conceptions of what it takes to be a truthful person. And there's a wonderful passage from James Joyce about Rousseau. It says, excuse me, I want to ask you, do you believe that Jean-Jacques Rousseau is a sincere man? Stephen, this is from Portrait of the Artist as a young man, of course. Stephen laughed. He was like you, I fancy, said Stephen, an emotional man. So, don't know whether he was sincere or not, but he sure was emotional. I don't want to spend too much time on Rousseau, although Rousseau writes his confessions, but there's a confusion here. What is that confusion? So Rousseau, in his political ethics and his philosophy, namely the social contract, and also on the discourse on the origins of inequality, and some of his novels and some of his, not just the Confessions, is quite astute about many things. He's certainly astute about inequality and the harms that inequality does. But Rousseau has all these other problems. He's remarkably similar to a figure we encountered in our last episode, Ludwig von Beethoven. He could not get along with anybody. And he grew to hate society and eventually retired and left society, became a hermit. And so there's a tension between this sort of communal or communitarian aspect of Rousseau's thought that we need to live in society with his rejection of society. So if I can't live in society, if I don't get along with people, society must be, of course, to blame. Right. And so that's kind of the assumption there in his mindset. And there's a question of idiosyncrasy. I'm skipping around here. It says here, and this is a Bernard Williams prose here, it followed that there was virtually no one with whom Rousseau could live. So he couldn't live with anybody. His own sincerity would lay him open to others' malice, and indeed he would be laid open to violating that sincerity himself. One motive for his retiring from social life, as he saw, was that he wanted to avoid the encounters that, given his weakness and embarrassment, could lead him into lying. The sincere man of sensibility ends up alienated from society altogether, where, quote, society, unquote, seems to mean simply everyone else. But sincerity was supposed to be the heart of virtue. And to conclude unconditionally that sincerity must exclude life with other people would be a disaster. Then there has to be an account of society that explains what is wrong with it and how it involves a perversion of what people might otherwise be. And I just mentioned the discourse origins is the basis of inequality, and social contract, taking men as they are and laws as they might be. So Rousseau did not take men as they are or were, or women for that matter, as they are or were, as he found them. He didn't take anybody, of course. Now, I don't want to be anachronistic. It's very tempting to talk about Rousseau or Ludwig von Beethoven or any of these figures talk about them as creatures of 2025, that we're all here right now, and we're armed with all of these labels, many of them from psychiatry and psychology, personality disorders, scientific DSM-D type labels. I don't want to do that because we are not in 2025. We are in, say, 1750, 1720. And it's not as interesting to me. The story is told that Napoleon, visiting as first consul a room at Ermenonville, in which Rousseau lived at the end of Rousseau's life, he said, "He was a madman, your Rousseau. It was he who brought us to where we are now." So this is Napoleon regretting the malign bad influence of Rousseau on Napoleon's own behavior, perhaps, all of France, not just the Jacobins, and the terror. And of course, Rousseau is probably unfairly blamed. Isiah Berlin blames Rousseau as one of the original totalitarians, that he sees in Rousseau a little bit of Joseph Stalin to come many, many hundreds of years later, for example. So maybe there's a connection between his inability to be in society, to honor his obligations towards others, to be a loyal friend, to just get along with people, and the totalitarian temptation. I don't know. Again, that would all be speculation. But anyhow, as Bernard Williams, he presses on this. If there is such a thing as the real self of an individual, what reason is there to think that it must coincide with an underlying character of honor, considerateness, and compassion? If real sincerity reveals the real self, that may not be, as Rousseau assumed. Remember, Rousseau thought we were all just born good. As Rousseau assumed, a citizenly self. And sincerity may not be what a shared political life requires, but rather the reverse, as the cynics of the Ancient regime took for granted. And of course it mentions Lionel Trilling's commentary on Wordsworth's Michael. The shepherd, stricken by grief, if the son leaves the town, goes to the big city. Trilling, so Bernard Williams quotes Lionel Trilling here, says, "We are impelled to use some word which denotes the nature of this being and which accounts for the high value we put upon it. The word we employ for this purpose is authenticity. However, authenticity does not have to be, as the shepherd's was, inarticulate. Indeed, the whole point of authenticity as a characteristically modern value has lain in the attempt to regain in some reflective form, the unexpressed certainties which are supposed to have structured the pre-modern world. But however authenticity is expressed as an ideal, it is clear that its demands will not necessarily coincide with the demands of anyone else, or indeed anyone else's authenticity." So, Rameau's nephew. So Williams introduces Diderot in his own way. He says, if anything is emblematic of the Enlightenment, it must be the encyclopedia. At the center of it was Denis Diderot. He invented it and was its editor along with D'Alembert, and he did most of the work. He promoted it, he defended it from the censors, wrote a lot of it, plagiarized other books to put into it, went hungry, and was sent to jail for it. That's a wonderful sentence that Williams just wrote there. See, this is the energy he generates with that sentence like that. The encyclopedia was not for all that one man's work. It was an enterprise. And its organization and reception constituted a complex social fact. So he did all these things. It was this, it was that, it was that. It was also a complex social fact. That phrase is very Williamsian, if I can say that. Bernard Williams is going to come again and again back to his theme of his life's work in this and ethics and philosophy, that as human beings, we do not live theories and systems, or in theories and systems. We live with one another. And we have to learn. We have at the very minimum must get along with each other. We have to share, of course, a truth, a universal truth that was brought home to me personally, never more so than during the pandemic and COVID, when the question of what do we hold in common, among many other things, the air we breathe, for example. But it was a complex social fact, this encyclopedia, but it is interesting what the man who had this relation to it was like. In other words, Williams says that we're like something, we're with other people, and Diderot was funny, passionate, disordered, sometimes sentimental, and sometimes, as it would seem to a modern taste, cruelly malicious. And we've already gone over how the history of Rameau's nephew. This is what the narrator Diderot says about Rameau nephew, Rameau, we'll use the same name, Louis, him, he. It says, he is one of the oddest characters in this land of ours where God has not been sparing of them. He is a compound of high and low, good sense and insanity. The notions of what is decent and what is not must be strangely muddled in his head. For the good qualities nature has given him he displays without ostentation, and the bad ones without shame. It goes on to say that this kid flatters his betters, and he acts as a court jester to the rich. He has just been thrown out of the household of a wealthy official called Bertin, and Bertin's mistress, and according to this is Mademoiselle Hugh of the Comédie Française. I want to go into theater history here. She's an important figure in the Comédie Française, part of French theater. So his appearance, his clothes, his build vary greatly from time to time, depending on his fortunes. He is resentful, he is envious, particularly of his famous uncle, but also maniacally cheerful. He has wild swings of mood, even in one conversation. He has a deafening voice and amazing powers of mimicry. And in the course of the dialogue, he goes into several turns, toward the end rendering all the parts of several pieces from French opera. So he's an expert on French opera, can quote all the operas of the day, like his uncle, right? For example. He discusses virtue and vice, sincerity and hypocrisy, philosophy and scientific materialism, French and Italian opera. And then here's Williams. He says, Rameau's nephew has caused critics a lot of anxiety. There has been a question of what the dialogue is supposed to be about. But it is not clear why there has to be any one thing that it is about. So he's saying, why does it have to be about any one thing? Why can't just the beauty of the dialogue itself, the to and fro, the back and forth of the kid and the older man, be its own entertainment, its own delight, its own edification, its own wisdom, its own, you get the convenience. Critics are worried too, and I said this before, about the point of view we are supposed to adopt. Are we going to be like great George Friedrich Hegel and said, follow the nephew, the kids? What do we adopt? It is already clear from the surface of the conversational drama that neither Louis nor Moi is an authority figure. Moi, though he makes various interpretive and sometimes condemnatory remarks and asides, is a real collaborator in some of Rameau's more outrageous opinions. So that even though you set up this opposition, the old man or Rameau, Diderot, agrees with Rameau on many things and collaborates with him in some of the jokes. So Louis, the kid, has had some encouragement from Moi when he gets going on the psychology of virtue. And this is another wonderful quote from the novel. Here's the kid talking. You think that happiness is the same for all. What a strange illusion you have. Yours presupposes a certain fanciful, Romanesque turn of mind that we don't all possess, a special type of soul, a peculiar taste. You dignify this oddity with the name of virtue, and you call this philosophy. But are virtue and philosophy made for everyone? And one of the things that Rameau's nephew calls moi throughout this text is Mr. Philosopher. He says, Mr. Philosopher. So he's deprecatory. I mean, he has attitude, as we expect a kid to have, right? Why do you so often see the pious so hard, so tiresome, so unsociable? Devil take me as I know at the end and what I am, is what he says. Wilma Anderson has said, Wilma Anderson wrote a book on Rameau's nephew. Haven't read her in some time, but she says Rameau's nephew is a text that each reader has to process for himself or herself. So Marx read it one way, Freud read it another way, Engels, Goethe, Schiller, Mitch Hampton, your host, we all read it in our own way. That this should be so is entirely true of it. True to it, that this would be the case. It says here, Hegel is contemptuous of moi, whom he takes to stand for convention. Bernard Williams says Rameau is true to himself in at least this sense, that he is conspicuously not self-deceived. So he, in a sense, knows himself and he presents himself in all of his wildness. Right? He flatters and lies. He does do that, but he admits that he does so. In fact, there's a passage where he says, well, this is how you lie to this person. This is how you flatter this wealthy patron. This is how you do it. This is what I do. He's transparent about his flattery and his lying. And there's a kind of, a sincerity in that, actually, right? And Williams goes on to say, in these qualities, he offers an exceptionally clear example of sincerity in its basic form of uninhibited expression or enactment, rather than in the form of reporting the findings of self-examination. He's spontaneous. He is, this is Bernard Williams' formulation, to a greater extent than moi, Louis, is disintegrated. That's Bernard Williams' term, disintegrated. Not whole. One thing on Monday, another thing on Tuesday. And this is the criticism that Williams has of the kid, of Rameau's nephew, is that in the end, he lacks integrity. He's charming, he's joke-telling, he's entertaining, but he lacks integrity. And this gets to the heart of Diderot's disagreement with Rousseau. Because, as Bernard Williams says, we have to consider Diderot's outlook. On Diderot's view, as I understand him, it is a universal truth, not just a special feature of modernity. Is Bernard Williams quoting Jane Austen there? It is a universal truth that in possession of a fortune, what, husband and wife, the opening was it Emma or forgetting now, is it universal truth, universally acknowledged that a person in possession of a fortune must be needing a wife, a man with a fortune, right? Universal truth. That's interesting. Universal truth, not just a special feature of modernity, that human beings have an inconstant mental constitution that needs to be steadied by society and interactions with other people. So think about that in 2025. Everybody in their bubbles, everybody glued to their screen, not getting out, not sharing with other people in real place, real time. That condition, in Bernard Williams' wonderful reading of Diderot, makes for an unsteady mind, a chaos, basically, moral and otherwise, unsteady mind. Different people and people in different circumstances are steadied by these forces to a greater or lesser degree. And then he goes on to say modernity, that's the period of, let's say, 1760 to now, or if we include postmodernity in modernity. Modernity makes it hard to be steady. That's what Bernard Williams says. It makes it hard. It distracts us. It challenges us, but we still should strive for steadiness. It's hard to steady them. This picture of the mind implies that it has relations to other people and to society that are quite different from any imagined by Rousseau. So this is, of course, an irony. Rousseau wrote all about society. What is the ideal society, the social contract? How should we govern? And yet himself could not live with anybody and could not be in society. A little bit like Ted Kaczynski preaching at us from his cabin. A little bit. I don't want to be too unfair to Rousseau. Rousseau was, of course, or to Ted Kaczynski, because after all, as Chuck Klosterman writes in the 90s, if Ted Kaczynski was right about any one thing, he was perhaps right about the computer and the coming internet. But putting that little quip aside, that what Rameau declares at one time may be markedly different from what he declares at another, and his declarations may all be sincere. At least he spontaneously and uninhibitedly comes out with what is in his mind. Williams goes on to say, but if his declarations are too whimsically inconstant, there comes a question of what kind of thing is it that is in his mind. In other words, if he's going from to and fro and back and forth in mid-sentence, we might ask ourselves, well, what is in his mind to begin? In other words, what kind of a thing is it that he's spewing out? Right? We could ask that. Not just assume that it's thoughts in the mind, but what kind of a thing is this? We might say, what kind of a person is this kid, right? You could say that. With regard to beliefs in particular, it is not simply that a person will seem inconsistent or contradictory or hopeless if they change too often. Rather, if they change too often for internal reasons, they will not be beliefs, but rather something like propositional moods. And so Bernard Williams uses the phrase propositional mood to describe just things that pass and flow that aren't so solid, right? And I should say that Bernard Williams is an advocate of what he calls internalism. And internalists feel that everything we do and are has to, again, has to matter to us. Has to matter to us. So it should give us greatest pause to consider if we want to create a world in which we give over all the functions of society to robots and AI, it should give us pause that we're giving it over to alien entities that don't have an inside, in a sense that there's nobody really home. So that's an interesting something that we should consider. One of the great things about having a democratic public deliberation where you have people come to the table is that the people show up and they say, well, this is what I think. That's what Rachel thinks. This is what Bob thinks. And we can hear from their own oral account of what they think about any given topic. But to be cut off from each other or to give it all over to abstract documents on a sheet of paper, as much as God knows, I love sheets of paper. I love this book. There's few things I love more, but even I know that what makes this book special is that there was a man named Bernard Williams who lived in Oxford and taught at the university and was a British guy and that had profound love for Nietzsche and opera. And he brings all of that knowledge of opera and love of Nietzsche into his last text that he writes at the end of his life, or any of these other people. And that even Rousseau brings his dislike of other people, his misanthropy, if that's the word, his extravagant misanthropy into Emile and the social contract and discourse on the origins of inequality and his confessions. And I say all this as a host for this show who has read Augustine's Confessions and Rousseau's Confessions. And I've read Diderot, and I've read Bernard Williams' Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy. And in some instances have had seminars with some of these professors. For one thing, Tim Scanlon. I don't know whether to stop now or not. I fear I've gone on for too long, and we've only scratched the surface. But I thought it'd be interesting to discuss, an argument between two historical literary figures, and they're falling out their disagreement, to bring up questions, again, not answers, questions, better questions about how we ought to live and the rest of it. Please like and subscribe to our show, Journey of an Aesthete Podcast. The year-long anniversary of Hurricane Helene is upon us, of course, and in about a week we are going to mark that fateful day with an episode with Shelley McKenzie, a wonderful book editor, speaking of books, who compiled a volume called Stronger Than the Storm about the experiences of people in our Asheville here. And that is coming up. Yes, other episodes, much to come. I'm playing piano 10:30 a.m. Saturday morning on the 20th. If you want to come by, if you're in town, playing some piano with a special guest. Guitar player Bill Wilson. And as our producer Laurie Strickland points out to us now, we are going to give away 2 books, copies of Stronger Than the Storm. More on that soon. There's so much more to say. We will return with another episode of Aesthetic Stream. And since I had some challenges about copyright strikes and whatnot of showing clips, I'm going to go back to the drawing board and think about different ways of talking about movies and TV shows. And we have a crime episode about Charles Manson. Things in the future coming up, so there's a lot to consider. But to conclude this episode, it was a dense one. It was a wordy one. It was filled with lots of words, lots of passages and sentences. After all, human beings in 2004, 1720, 1805, 1972, human beings wrote these things on paper for us to enjoy them, for us to experience, as I like to put it, the soul of their syntax, and reach our own point in our journey as we go forward in time. So thank you, and I hope you do have a good rest of the weekend.